Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're exploring a hidden, often completely overlooked public health threat. And we're not talking about a danger you can easily spot or, hear coming from a mile away. We're talking about an enemy that operates entirely under the radar, literally hiding in the most mundane spaces you can imagine. It's called Hantavirus. Over the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly what this virus is, the frankly surprising ways it moves into the human body, and what actually happens once it gets there.
So think about this for a second. How is it possible to get severely sick from an infected animal without ever actually seeing, touching, or interacting with it at all? Think about the places you might work, or maybe an old garage or a dusty shed you might decide to clean out on the weekend. We usually associate getting sick from an animal with a bite, a scratch, or at the very least, being in the exact same room as the creature, right? But with hantavirus, the culprit has often long since left the scene.
Well, the dramatic answer is literally floating in the air. It's all about the inhalation of aerosol particles. The primary danger of hantavirus is that it's airborne. It absolutely doesn't require a physical confrontation with a rodent. You don't need a direct culprit staring back at you. Instead, the threat is suspended right there in the air you're breathing, just waiting to be inhaled. It's a fascinating but definitely frightening biological mechanism.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the invisible threat. What is hantavirus?
First up, we need to define the foundational term for this whole explainer. Hantavirus is a zoonotic disease. Basically, these are diseases that cross the biological barrier, transmitting from animals directly to humans and causing illness. But what makes hantavirus such a unique zoonotic threat is exactly what we just touched on. It makes this leap across species through environmental routes. It simply doesn't need that direct physical contact with the infected animal to pass the infection on to us.
So, what are we dealing with biologically? At its core, hantavirus is an RNA virus. The primary carriers out in the wild are infected mice and rats. And once it enters the human body, it doesn't just cause a mild cold, it actually targets major internal systems, specifically causing severe respiratory and kidney issues. Crucially, and this is the big takeaway here, this infection can rapidly lead to life-threatening complications if it isn't diagnosed early. Time is absolutely of the essence.
Now, what's really interesting is how it spreads, which brings us to Section 2 transmission routes and risks.
It all starts with something totally mundane, the everyday bodily fluids of rodents. We're talking urine, feces, and saliva. These rodents just go about their business, scurrying through dark, quiet spaces, leaving behind these fluids. It really builds this incredible tension when you realize that these ordinary, tiny traces left behind by a single mouse can transform into a profound human health threat.
Let's walk through the real-world scenario of how this actually plays out. Step 1. Those fluids, the urine, feces, or saliva from an infected rodent, are left in a closed space like a barn, an attic, or a shed, and they just dry out over time. Step 2. A human enters the picture. You grab a broom to sweep up, or maybe you start moving some old boxes around. You disturb the area. That physical action of cleaning acts as the trigger. And Step 3. That disturbance causes those dried particles to aerosolize. They float right up into the air in a microscopic dust cloud, and you inhale those virus-containing particles directly into your lungs. You've essentially been infected simply by breathing while cleaning.
Now, while breathing in those aerosolized particles is for sure the most common route, there are a few secondary ways the virus can enter the body. If you touch a contaminated surface, say a dusty shelf where a mouse happened to be, and then you touch your mouth, your nose, or your eyes, you can inadvertently introduce the virus into your system. There is also the risk of direct contact or bites from infected rodents, though honestly, those occurrences are actually quite rare compared to the airborne route.
To ground this science in reality, we have to look at who is actually encountering this threat the most on a day-to-day basis. The data points us directly to specific, high-risk occupational groups, agricultural and construction workers. And why them? Well, because the very nature of their jobs requires them to constantly enter, disrupt, and clear out closed, dusty environments. Things like barns, silos, abandoned buildings, and excavation sites. These are exactly the places where rodent populations tend to thrive completely unnoticed.
Let's move on and see how this builds physically in Section 3, Clinical Pictures and Symptoms.
The presentation of hantavirus is incredibly deceptive. The symptoms span a massive, wide range. On one end of the spectrum, you might just feel like you've caught a mild bug. In fact, early symptoms can deceptively mimic a simple everyday flu. But depending on the specific type of the virus you've contracted and the strength of your own immune system, those mild signs can rapidly escalate into severe, truly life-threatening clinical pictures. Globally, hantavirus basically manifests in one of two major clinical ways. First, there's hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS, which aggressively targets your respiratory system. Then, on the flip side, we have hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, or HFRS, which, exactly as the name suggests, heavily impacts kidney function and causes bleeding issues. Both of these are incredibly serious, and both vividly demonstrate exactly why early diagnosis is absolutely critical before these specific syndromes can fully take hold.
So the crucial point is, after all this talk of severe symptoms and invisible transmission, we really need a deep breath of strategic reassurance. The medical literature is incredibly clear here. Human-to-human transmission is generally not observed. This is a vital piece of the puzzle. While hantavirus is severe and easily caught from the environment, an infected individual does not generally spread it to their family, their friends, or their caregivers. Because it doesn't spread person to person, public health officials can actually control and manage it by focusing purely on environmental safety and rodent control rather than having to quarantine people.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. The very next time you open the door to a dusty, closed-up garage, an attic, or a shed, the next time you grab a broom to sweep up a space that's been sitting quiet for months, will you be thinking about what's hiding in the air? Knowledge really is your best defense here. By understanding how this invisible enemy operates, you can take the proper precautions, like ventilating spaces before you enter and wearing proper masks, to ensure that the air you breathe remains safe. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe out there.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring something fascinating and honestly incredibly relevant to all of us. We're looking at how human psychology, rather than just actual physical events, has become the absolute primary driver of our financial markets. We're going to break down the true economic architecture of viral fear, using recent headlines about viruses like Hantavirus as a lens to understand a massive, systemic shift in global finance. So think about this for a second. What's actually more dangerous to the global economy? A deadly virus, or simply the fear of it? It kind of sounds like a philosophical riddle, right? But this is exactly the question we have to ask ourselves every single time a new health headline breaks. Why? Because the answer directly impacts your wallet, your investments, and the cost of the daily goods you rely on. The modern economy has evolved, and understanding this distinction is absolutely crucial for navigating the world today. Section 1. The economic power of fear. A new driving force. There is a really stark contrast between biological facts and market reality. For instance, a pathogen like hantavirus might have a high mortality rate, but crucially, its capacity to spread globally is quite limited compared to something like COVID-19. Yet, the market reaction is often completely disproportionate. We see global panic, massive strategic shifts, and a severe psychological impact. You see, markets do not trade on medical facts, they trade entirely on the anticipation of worst-case scenarios. Here's the real kicker. When news of a virus surfaces, the immediate market reaction isn't actually a fear of the virus itself, but a profound, almost paralyzing dread of its potential logistical consequences. Today's global financial architecture is built primarily on trust, expectation, and risk perception. The modern economy doesn't sit around waiting for a crisis to actually happen. The mere possibility of a crisis is enough to trigger massive structural shifts. It's an economy driven just as much by what could be as by what is. Section 2, the first strike, vulnerable sectors. The second a scary global headline grabs the public's attention, investors don't wait to see how things play out. They immediately dump risky assets, creating intense, sudden selling pressure across highly vulnerable industries. We're talking aviation, tourism, hospitality, transportation, and energy. These are the front lines. Because they rely heavily on human movement and everyday consumption, they are incredibly sensitive to even the slightest drop in global confidence. Let's literally walk through this domino effect together. Step 1, the outbreak news hits. Now, investors don't wait for governments to act. They immediately jump to Step 2, anticipating severe travel restrictions. That anxiety bleeds right into Step 3, rampant consumer fear, which finally culminates in Step 4, massive supply chain problems. Investors are aggressively pricing in the travel bans and supply issues they nearly assume will happen. They are mapping out the disaster before it even materializes. Section 3, supply and energy market collapse. Look, we're all living in a deeply traumatized post-COVID world, and our supply chains are still incredibly sensitive. Because of the trauma of recent years, even minor localized health crises trigger completely disproportionate fears. If a health issue pops up in a major manufacturing hub, whether that's China, the US, or Europe, investors immediately panic that global manufacturing is just going to abruptly halt. This fear threatens everything from the production of tiny microchips to massive automotive sectors. And right next to manufacturing is the energy sector. If the fear of a global pandemic grows, the energy market goes into an absolute tailspin. We start seeing predictions of falling oil demand because, well, planes might stop flying and trucks might stop driving. This leads to sharp, unpredictable movements in energy prices and intensely heightened volatility across all commodity markets. The fear literally shakes the foundational resources of the globe. To really wrap your head around how violently energy markets react to fear, just remember this number: 0. Think back to that incredible, extreme data point from the early days of the COVID-19 panic. Oil prices actually plummeted to negative levels for a brief period. Producers were effectively willing to pay buyers to take oil off their hands because they feared a total, absolute collapse in global demand. That wasn't a biological symptom. That was pure, unadulterated economic terror. Because of these profound traumas, the whole paradigm has completely shifted. Every single medical headline is immediately translated into a financial threat assessment. Investors no longer view new pandemic risks simply as localized healthcare issues for doctors to manage. No, they view them as direct, systemic economic threats that could unravel global stability in a matter of days. Section 4. An already fragile world. The global economy setup. Now, I need to make this super clear. Based on current data, there is no strong evidence that a pathogen like Hantavirus has a COVID-like global spread capacity. The physical risk of a repeat global lockdown from this specific virus is low. So why the outsized market anxiety? Well, because the real economic risk right now isn't the virus's physical spread. The real risk is the intense, almost allergic reaction from people in markets who are already living right on the edge. And the reason for that intense reaction is pretty obvious when you look at the big picture. The global economy is already sick. It's carrying massive pre-existing conditions. We're dealing with high inflation eating away at purchasing power, ongoing wars disrupting trade routes, persistent energy crises, rising geopolitical tensions, and incredibly heavy global debt burdens. The global economy is exceptionally fragile right now, which perfectly explains exactly why it reacts so rapidly and aggressively to any new health threat. To see the tangible fallout of this panic on such a fragile system, let's follow the chain reaction. As fear mounts, step 1 happens. You, the consumer, stop spending. Step 2, because you aren't spending, businesses stop investing in new projects. Step 3, companies scramble to reduce risk, which means hiring freezes and layoffs. And finally, step 4, central banks, which are already stretched incredibly thin, are forced to frantically intervene just to prop up the system. Fear alone chokes the economic engine. Section 5. Expectations, not facts. The final truth. The truth is, small hiccups cause massive chain reactions today because our modern global economy is bound together tighter than ever before. Economists view isolated events, like a localized hantavirus outbreak, not merely as healthcare tests for a specific region. They view them as brutal stress tests of our global psychological resilience. They expose the hidden fault lines in our hyper-connected world, where a sneeze in one hemisphere can literally cause a market crash in the other. Take a second to really absorb this crucial reality. In the modern world, economic crises are no longer born solely from facts, but from expectations and fears. Your financial world, your job security, even the prices at your local grocery store. They're all profoundly shaped by what everyone is simply terrified might happen next. So the next time a frightening headline breaks, ask yourself, are the markets reacting to the reality of the threat, or are we simply witnessing the economic architecture of viral fear at work? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always look a little deeper at the headlines.